what I'd like to do is to go through the entire history of electricity and telecoms in about 25 minutes.
Excellent.
So we must start way back. The thing is, how far back? Well, I would imagine that people in the Stone Age knew something about electricity because there were lightning storms and they would look up and see flashes in the sky and wonder what was going on. But it wasn't until an American named Benjamin Franklin flew a kite on the end of a string up into a thundercloud and drew sparks off the wet string that scientific investigation of electricity really began. I think he was foolish. He may well have electrocuted himself, but he survived. And it was that sort of static electricity, the type that's generated during a thunderstorm, that the experimenters began with. Now, I suppose it was the Victorians who really began to study electrical phenomena really scientifically. And one of the things they liked to play with was, in fact, static electricity, and so they developed machines like this. This is not connected to anything, not the mains, not a battery, it's just itself. But as I wind these glass discs, eventually it will build up a charge so that we get a miniature lightning storm that is about 60,000 volts. So before I dare touch it, I have to make sure there's a spark and a spark, that the thing is discharged and then it's safe to touch. The problem with that, of course, is it doesn't give you very long to experiment. Flash, and then it's gone. So when an Italian named Mr. Volta developed the world's first battery, that was fine. You could get current flowing through a piece of wire for half an hour if you wanted, and you could therefore do things with it. And every university, every college lab had a battery. It was the latest sort of gadget to show to your students. And a Danish professor was showing his students that when current from a battery flows through a wire, if the battery is powerful enough, the wire gets hot. And it was quite by accident that on the bench in his lab, there was an ordinary magnetic compass. Just happened to be there. And it was noticed that when the current flowed through the wire, the compass needle moved. So things like this were developed. There's a compass needle there. There's nothing electrical about it. It's actually hanging from a bit of my wife's silk sewing thread. In the wooden ring, there's a loop of wire, and down here I have a battery. When I send current around the loop, the needle moves. Well, interesting laboratory demonstration, but so what, I hear you cry. Well, there are people who saw more into this than just that. They said, look, why don't we take that into Penzance? And we'll have the battery in the switch here, and then we'll take a piece of wire all the way along the road, and we'll go through the coil in Penzance. When we press the key at Porthcurno, 9 miles away, the needle will move. Movement at a distance. Fine, but how can we use that to really send an intelligent message? Well, this country led the world in telegraphy, and largely it was because we led the world in railways. Stockton-Darlington Railway in the 1830s, and it was Brunel, the great Victorian engineer, who built the Great Western Railway all the way from Paddington eventually to Penzance, who had a problem. The problem, the train travelled faster than the fastest galloping horse. So how could you get a message to sort of overtake the train and stop it in case of a derailment or a bridge swept away in a flood or something of that kind? So Brunel put up some money. He sponsored another man named Wheatstone to take this thing out of the college lab and to produce something that they could use on the railways. And what he did was fiddle about with various rather complicated things that I won't bore you with, and then ended up with this. He put his horizontal needle vertical. Instead of one switch, he had a kind of double switch, which meant that the needle could move either to the left or to the right. You see the white bit on the bottom moving if you can't see the black needle. Left, right, left, right, left, right. What's happening? We have a battery here, we go through the coil, we go under the floor, and up there, can you see a green dial? And we go through that coil. So whatever happens here, the same will happen there. You can see the needle moving, left, right, left, right, left, right. Now that's 15 feet away. It could be 300 miles away in London if we had a piece of wire 300 miles long and a battery powerful enough. So how do you send a message? Well, because you've got two directions, you can create a code, rather like Morse code, dots and dashes, only this is lefts and rights. The letter A is left, right. The letter B is right, left, 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 and so on. As long as you can remember the code, you can send the whole works of Shakespeare if you want to. Nice little writing pad here to write down the message. If you're receiving a message that's coming in, you write it down, watching the needle, and then you go away to make yourself a cup of coffee, because this is on the railways, remember, and you're in a signal box and there's some message about a train being delayed or whatever, so it's not very busy. You go away, you're just about to drink your cup of coffee when you hear a faint tinkling noise, because there's another message coming in. So you carefully put your cup down, and by the time you've got your pencil out and got round here, you've missed the first 2 or 3 letters, haven't you? So on the American railways, they said, we don't like things you've got to look at. We prefer to take the message not by eye, but by ear. And they invented something which they called a sounder, obviously, because it made a sound. Can you? You can. Marvellous. What that said in genuine sounder code was, can you read this, question mark? And occasionally somebody does say yes, and I know that we have a retired railway telegraphist in the room, and I have to be careful what I say from then on. It's the brass thing in the middle there, and that's all it does, makes that clickety-clack noise, and you have to interpret it by ear. There were simpler things on the railways for people who didn't want to learn an entire alphabet. There were simple bell signals, and I have here genuine British Rail, long before the days of rail track, bell signal. Have you ever been on a station, some years ago now, I guess, and heard something like this? Ting, 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 2 followed by 3. That means the 2:30 train is about to arrive. Or that's 5:05, or it's 11:55, and so on. Every train would have probably a 2-figure bell code, which was related to its nominal time of arrival. You know, the 11:55 is still the 11:55, even if it doesn't arrive till 12:30. It's the delayed 11:55. And so you could signal the train, pass it on from station to station using these simple bell codes. There were other codes that were even simpler. I don't know whether you can all see this or not, but we have a model here of an old semaphore signal. And I'm in a signal box 10 miles away, and if you watch that, you will see that when the bell tings, the arms move. This is a device so that I, in my signal box, when I pull one of those big levers, electrically transmits to the next signal box, which may be 10 miles away, what my signals are doing. Because the railways used what was called block signalling, which meant that every 10, 15, 20 miles of track was under the control of a guy in a signal box. Before a train could leave this block and be passed on to the next block, the 2 signal boxes had to communicate that it was safe to do so, because on the next block there might have been a derailment or something. And this was a way of ensuring that each signal box knew what the signals were doing on the next block. All of this on the railways. But it wasn't long before people said, look, why leave it to the railways? Instead of laying wires along the railway line, we can lay wires on wooden poles, China insulators, overhead, along the main roads. And we can link up the main towns and cities, and we think the public will be willing to pay money to send messages faster than the galloping horse or the mail coach. The same thing was happening in Europe. And by 1850, again, it was British entrepreneurs who said, look, why don't we link England with Europe? Let's lay a piece of wire across the sea, across the channel. They chose the narrowest spot, Dover to Calais, and they laid a single wire. And what they laid was something that looks like this. Don't know how well you can see it. It's rather thin copper wire. It's surrounded with black sticky stuff called gutta percha. That's a resin that comes from a tropical tree, and that was to keep the electricity in, to keep the seawater out, in other words, insulation. And that was it, just like that. In fact, they had to fit lead weights on it to keep it on the bottom. They tried to use a rather complicated telegraph instrument. Once it was laid, it didn't work. They went and borrowed one of these railway telegraphs. They sent a few test messages, and then the story goes that Queen Victoria sent a message of congratulations to the French government. This new link heralded a new era in international cooperation and it stopped working in the middle of the message. And the story, which may be apocryphal, but it is in some of the textbooks, says that a French fisherman had hooked this up by accident, thought it was the stem of some strange new type of seaweed, and ripped a piece off to take home to show to his wife. Well, it had worked for 2 or 3 hours, long enough to prove that if you could prevent French vandalism, the technology was fine. And so the next year, they tried again, 1851. The bit that did the work was very much like that, but they surrounded that with steel armouring or sheathing wires, which did nothing electrically, but were to protect the bit in the middle. And that second cable was still working after about 30 years. So other businessmen and entrepreneurs said, look, if we can connect England with Europe from Dover to Calais, 26 miles under the sea, why don't we connect England with the New World? North America, Canada. So only a few years later, 1856, and by the time they got it finished, 1858, they had a go at laying a cable all the way under the sea across the North Atlantic, over 2,000 miles. And then there was a problem. The amount of electricity that arrived in France over 26 miles was enough to operate one of these quite happily. The amount that arrived in New York, or wherever the thing landed after 2,000 miles, was so minute, so tiny, that it would not operate any of this equipment. The answer came from a chap called William Thomson, who was later Lord Kelvin of Glasgow University. And his answer was the arrangement here, not the bits in the middle, but this and this. I light a lamp, and it shines through a little glass window into here. Now inside here, there's something rather like that delicately suspended needle, which was the first thing you saw, and on it is a tiny mirror, which reflects the spot of light back onto the screen. Perhaps you can see it below my hand there. The slightest movement of the magnet there, and in later versions a coil, will deflect the spot of light an amount that's easy to see. It's rather like having one of those needle telegraphs with a needle which is 4 feet long. It doesn't weigh anything because it's a beam of light. So this will respond to exceedingly small signals. So how do you receive the message? Well, if you watch this and imagine that that and that are over somewhere in North America, and this is the North Atlantic, and I'm over here in Britain, I press a double key which will deflect the spot of light either to the left or to the right. So it's the old railway code, left and right. So it looks like this: left, left, right, left. That's the letter F in Morse, or cable code in this case. Left, right, left, R, I, E, N, D, S. Friends, Romans, countrymen. Now, see how long it took?
Between letters, so you weren't finished?
Yes, you had to leave a little bit of a gap. But it was very slow, very tedious, and it took that time to send one letter. And at the other end, this end, there was somebody watching that spot of light, and we're underground and the light's not that bright, but in broad daylight, you really had to sit with a blanket over your head or behind a screen to see this, because their spot of light wasn't what I'm using, a car tail lamp bulb, it was a candle. So their spot of light was even dimmer than that and probably flickering as well, and so you needed 2 people. The reader, who sat watching the spot of light and called out the letters one by one, F, R, on the other side of the blanket, under a swinging oil lamp, I guess, the writer wrote down in lovely copperplate the message as it was received. That's not actually a telegram, but this is how the telegrams would have looked, handwritten in lovely copperplate and delivered. This is, in fact, a memorandum to the staff here at Porthcurno. It says, I notice a great many errors are made from indistinct signals and from guessing. Who was doing the guessing? I think it was the reader watching the spot of light hour after hour, beginning to get spots before the eyes, and you'd only got to blink or move your head and you'd missed one of the letters, and they were guessing the missing letter, which was fine when it was plain text like happy birthday auntie and you left off the Y, you probably got it right. But many of the messages were in code, commercial code, 5-letter groups that made nonsense word, AFPMZ, MVMYP, and so on. It meant something to somebody at the other end, but nothing to the telegraphers for reasons of commercial secrecy. And if you guessed one of those letters and got it wrong, you really had no idea what the effect would be. You know, it might be that somewhere around the world somebody bought you a whole lot of shares in a failing company instead of selling the shares that you already owned. In all of this, there is no permanent record of the signal. You see, once the needle has waggled, it's waggled and that's it. Once you have listened to the then you have a coughing fit, you didn't hear what it said, did you? It's too late, it's gone. And if you blink twice while watching that, it's gone. So the answer was this: pot of ink, strip of paper, clockwork. When I set it going, the clockwork drives the paper past the pot of ink. Somebody at the other end of the line presses a key, and an electromagnet here smears the ink onto the paper tape. It's come out of the machine, never mind. Those in the front, I think, can see that there are some squiggly dot and dash signals on the paper tape. Things like this were used in the Crimean War. The military were very fond of these Morse inkers because no excuse for guessing, there was the message. But this took too much electricity to work on a long transatlantic cable. So the cable people were stuck with this mirror working until to the rescue came the man who invented this, William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, with a far more sensitive ink writer than this one here. And we have one in one of the glass cases, which you'll see later if you want to wander around. Now, down here, things were developing. They eventually introduced siphon recorders, as they were called, the sensitive equivalent of the Morse inker, onto the cable, the first cable, 1870, which went from here to India. By 1872, it had gone via India to Australia and then to New Zealand and was extended to the Far East, Hong Kong, all places where there was British interest. 1870, you could send a message, or 1872, message to Australia from here in, well, I know the signalling was slow, but you know, a minute or two. The alternative, write a letter and wait for the mailboat to take 6 weeks or 3 months, according to the way the winds were blowing. It was a great leap forward. So they did some more cables and some more and some more. And eventually this was the largest cable station in the world. There were eventually 14 cable systems radiating from the beach here all over the world, particularly all over what we still had in those days, the British Empire.
Were they down, underneath the beach? Right on
Yes, you couldn't see them. They were buried in the sand and lay on the bottom of the sea. If it was soft sand, they would sink into it. If it was rocky, they would just be lying there on the bottom.
How deep were they in the sand? Just when you
On the beach here, 6, 8 feet, something like that. Occasionally, after winter storms, the cables used to be exposed, and then they would go down when it was a working station, dig them in again. In the deep oceans, they were just lying on the bottom. But although it was the gateway to the world in 1900 and the biggest cable station in the world, in 1901 there was a threat. The threat was because a young Italian named Marconi came to Cornwall and he went down to a place called Poldhu Cove down on the Lizard, which you all know, put up some poles and succeeded in getting dots and dashes across the Atlantic without bothering to manufacture and lay 2,000 miles of cable. So the staff here were worried because the capital investment in manufacture and laying the cable was very much greater than the transmitting and receiving equipment on the two ends. So if Marconi didn't have to pay for the expensive bit in the middle, would he put them out of business? The staff here were instructed by their London head office to spy on Marconi. So they put up their own wooden pole up on the cliff beyond the Minack Theatre, and the base of it's still there to puzzle walkers on the coastal path. And they sat there with a pair of headphones listening into all of Marconi's early experiments. What they wanted to know was how fast can you signal? It wasn't speech, it was all code. Were the signals reliable or did they fade out? You know, was it a real commercial threat? And what they discovered, because we have the records of this eavesdropping in our archives here, was that in those very early years it wasn't very reliable. It didn't always work 24 hours a day. At times the operators could hardly decipher the signals. On one occasion it took Poldhu 24 hours to get a short text message of about that length, 2 or 3 sentences, through to a ship somewhere in the Mediterranean, 24 hours. The staff could come into the cable station, which in those days was the building outside, and get the same message through to an island in the Mediterranean, certainly not a ship, but an island, in 30 seconds. So it didn't seem to be a real commercial threat. The main application was ship-shore communications, from the shore to moving ships. It was a new niche in the market. That was fine. But as time went on, wireless developed, wireless improved. Marconi set up his beam wireless services, linking this country to all the countries of the British Empire, and he began to carry public messages in direct competition with the cables here. And the company in 1902, 1901, 1902 were not worried. By the late 1920s they were. And the British government of the day brought about a merger between the operating side of the Marconi company and the old Eastern Telegraph company here and other cable companies. And the two came together, and the logical name of the new company was Cable and Wireless. And that was the company that continued to operate the station here as mainly a cable, but also at times a wireless station, right through until it eventually closed. Let's bring ourselves a bit more up to date. At the outbreak of World War II, this network began to carry important government and military traffic. You see, you could send the signals around the world, around the British Empire, 2 ways. One was wireless, one was a cable under the sea. If you sent signals via wireless, the enemy could pick them up. And we were perhaps better at doing that than the Germans, because we had monitoring stations all the way along the south coast, one of them only a few miles from where we're sitting, which picked up German military communications. If they were coded, sent the information to Bletchley Park, Station X, where they were decoded. Now, because of that, messages of the highest security importance were sent by preference, not via wireless, but by cable. And this was the gateway to the world, really. I mean, there were some cables across from the southeast to France and Holland and so on, but as far as the greater world was concerned, this was the gateway. And one bomb on the building outside would have put the whole network out of operation. So the miners came from St Just, Pendine area, dug these tunnels, and the whole station moved underground for protection from bombing. When the war ended, it stayed here, and it didn't close until 1970, exactly 100 years after the first cable went into service. And that was the end of the cable station, which is now a museum. A footnote, however, is this. The station closed, the beach did not. What do I mean? Well, the beach is still an important cable landing. Just a couple of summers ago, one of the latest cables to be landed on the beach, Gemini, one of a pair of cables across the North Atlantic. I'm almost losing track. I think there's 4 or 5 working cables that land on the beach here, don't come into these tunnels, go up the valley and go to various other cable terminals, some disguised as farmers' granite barns and so on, which are working as we speak. Only unlike these telegraph cables, which have a copper wire carrying dot and dash type signals, these modern cables at the centre don't have a copper wire, they have one of those. And you say, one of what? A piece of cardboard? No, the thing down the bottom. You can't see it, can you? Well, you can pass it around.
Oh,
There is down there
good Lord.
an optic fibre, if you like, a wire made of glass, so thin that it's flexible, and of a special type of glass, which when you squirt a beam of light down the end, traps the light, and it just travels along the glass. So it's not electrical at all, it's optical. So how do we signal? Well, we've talked about lefts and rights. We've talked about dots and dashes in Morse. What about switching the light ons and offs? It's all what is called binary code. Now, those into computers know what we're talking about. Bits are binary digits, signals that have 2 conditions. This is binary. The signal is either the needle moves to the left or the needle moves to the right. There's no other valid signal. There were even some bell signals that were used when there were just two bells on the railways, left, right. So on a needle telegraph, the letter F, left, left, right, left, in bell signals was, got it? Simple. Binary. Well, switch the light on, switch it off, binary. So really, what's the difference? Well, the difference is the speed at which we do it. Now, just to finish, mustn't keep you too long, imagine that we've just laid this first cable from Porthcurno to Australia. The year is 1870 or 1872 by the time they reach Australia. 1870 they got as far as India. And we would want to export a little bit of culture. We know that the people in Australia are all convicted burglars and murderers and all the rest of it, convicts, but we would like them to have a bit of culture. And let's assume that they haven't got Shakespeare yet. Now we have a choice of two things. We can get the complete works of Shakespeare, wrap it up in brown paper, put it on a boat, and it'll be there a couple of months later, hopefully. Or we say, boy, we've got our new cable, let's send it to them telegraphically. So we sit down, we open the pages of Shakespeare, and we go like this. K, I, N, G, that's king. Lear, act. One. Now, if I have, it might be quick on the boat actually, because if I've got about 6 months to spare, I can turn the page, I can go through the whole of Shakespeare. It wouldn't be buzzing, it would be lefts and rights on there, but it's easier to demonstrate this way. Having done that, if we were silly enough to do it, they can then read one of the plays, they can rehearse it, they can put on a show. And the audience out there will either weep or laugh or be bored silly, as the case may be, but just think for a moment what we've done. All that intellectual heritage, all the history, all the pathos, all the poetry, all the humour, all the tragedy of the entire works of Shakespeare we've managed to get from here to the Antipodes. The bit in the middle was simply a dot or dash, a left or a right. That's all binary and digital is all about today. We can get a television program, we can get speeches, we can get music, we can get a telephone call, we can get transactions on the stock exchange from here to the Antipodes. But the bit in the middle is either a dot or a dash, only we call it a naught or a one. There you are, complete history of digital communications. The speed is the business. Here we're limited to how fast human wrists can rattle and all the rest of it.
When did the first fibre optics one go down?
The first transatlantic one, about 7, 8 years ago, I think, but fibre optics on the national network's a little bit earlier than that, but it's a relatively new technique. But instead of talking about a few pulses per second, we're now talking about gigabit rates. A gigabit is 1,000 million ons and offs, lefts and rights, dots and dashes, noughts and ones in a second. 1,000 million in a second. So the entire works of Shakespeare, instead of taking 6 weeks, as I demonstrated, only takes 6 seconds, and it's there. There we are. You may go now. Let me see. There'll be a short written examination at 4 o'clock.